stage for the first time, I think. But I'd like to welcome all three participants, Mr. Moulik, Mr. Dasgupta, Mrs. Dasgupta. Please take the stage, and will you please give them a hand?
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm sort of mixed with all kinds of forebodings because my earlier task as the director of the center was much easier, welcoming and thereafter thanking. But this time I will be in the unfamiliar role of a panelist, and I must start with a disclaimer. Barring Achala, who is the editor and author of this book, who can really speak well, neither me nor my wife are speakers at all. And so you will have to, I suppose, forgive our nervousness in facing such a distinguished gathering as I see before me today. And then I think I must mention, as I was going through the book, which was so kindly sent to me by Achala, the enormous amount of erudition and encyclopedic knowledge which has been capsuled in this very slim volume. It speaks, I think, volumes for the erudition and knowledge and understanding and empathy of the authors. Sadly, the two of them are no more, but Achala is there, and she would be able to give a proper background about this, and she would be also the right person, I think, to say that why she has chosen only 4. There are many others, one might question, who maybe, if not equally famous, maybe less famous, but equally volatile and brilliant in their own way, in their own time. But Achala has chosen this, and she has her own rationale for that. So without much ado, I request Achala to elucidate us on these points.
This book has a very strange history, and I don't think one can think of, I haven't read a book which began 70 years ago and completed just 2 years ago. The first author to start this was my aunt, my mother's younger sister. And for those who are not familiar with the book, let me just give you a very brief glimpse of their lives. My aunt, Bela, they came from a family in Dhaka, and Bengal, as you know, went through terrible trauma. First the famine, and then the partition, and the aftermath. And at this time, after the partition, my mother's sister and my mother's mother, they came away from Dhaka and lived with my parents for a while. Then my uncle, who was already working in the United Nations, the elder brother, took Bela away to Washington. He had married an American girl, and they thought she must get away from this very grim scenario. So she went to America, and it was for her, she described in her letters to my mother, it was like a new life. getting away from the trauma and the tragedy of partition. My grandmother didn't survive it, she said, from being an affluent wife of a Rabindranath to become a penurious widow living with relatives was terrible. So she went to Washington, she enrolled in a college there and started learning American history and American literature. And she was a very merry little girl, she was about 21, both very good in Bengali and English. She was a dancer and a singer and a great mimic. I've got her gift for mimicry. And so she was having a wonderful time, and in between in the midst of this, there was a young American lecturer who taught her, and he fell in love with her, and they decided to get married. Now, my aunt used to organize her dance programs in Washington, and one evening, she was invited to dance at the British Embassy. And after dancing, she suddenly collapsed on the stage. And of course, there was feeling she was either tired or whatever. She was taken to hospital, and everybody was surprised she was diagnosed with advanced tuberculosis. Now, whether she had hid it from everybody or she wasn't in any great discomfort, one never knew. So my uncle and aunt admitted her to a sanatorium in Virginia, where it was hoped she would recover. And she was full of spirits and was planning various things. And 1948, my father joined the Foreign Service, and his first posting was Washington. So my mother and Mashi were absolutely thrilled that this was putting an end to the years of tragedies. And finally, the doctors tried their best, but they said one lung was very badly infected and had to be removed. Now, while she was hoping to be recovered, she started writing this essay on Rabindranath. The reason I think she began with Rabindranath was, apart from being the greatest Indian of our age, the greatest poet of India, he had something which gave people courage. There is no episode in human life which he hasn't covered, and at the end of it, there's always hope. And this was a man who had lived through devastating tragedies. So Bela began writing a longish essay on Tagore, and she chose poems which would give inspiration to people. Maybe she meant it for herself. So she finished it, and it was a long essay. She chose certain poems from Rajput valor, from Mughal adventures. Rabindranath was very great admirer of the Sikhs, about the Sikh rebellion against Aurangzeb, various other things. And of course later Mother had to edit it. And then the day before her surgery, I don't know whether it was a she wrote a poem, and I think it was a premonition of what was going to happen. It's called Pandora's Gift, and it was dedicated to her fiancé, Justin. Fleeing despair and loss from fragmented lands, bravely I sailed over stormy seas, and came to this bright alien land to find you, Pandora's Gift. You awakened me to the splendor of life, the promise of love, as we walked by gardens in the light of dawn. With you I saw the radiance of stars, heard the roar of distant seas, the murmur of pines on snow-clad hills. With you I laughed again, you taught me to hope again. I wore my anklets to dance again, and strummed the sitar to sing again. In the shadow of paradise, I have no fear. You will be there to guide me to a new life. And she passed away 2 days later. So this after my mother arrived in Washington, Justin came to see her. He was flattered. And he handed over this essay she had written on Rabindranath. It was a long essay and very beautiful. And underneath was a strange mixture of both hope and despair. And he told her that, Leela, this is in Bengali, I can't read it or understand, so perhaps you do something. And so my mother decided that she would write about it. So that was how Rabindranath Tagore's essay came to be written. And I think there's so much to write about Rabindranath. Thousands of millions of words have been written. But I think what inspired Bela was this incandescent courage. Courage to live through terrible bereavements, as Gurudev had, which would shatter most human beings. Courage to defy the British in their oppression, especially from 1905 onwards. And in 1905, when Lord Curzon was planning the partition of Bengal, it's Tagore who led the movement, not Gandhi, not the Congress.
Yeah.
And he said, he told the Muslims, don't let them do the old divide and rule thing. So he led I think it was the first mammoth procession in India. He led a procession from Nakoda Masjid to the government house, which was still the house of the Viceroy. And there, on the way, Rabindranath got his Shantiniketan students to make rakis, handmade rakis, and every Hindu and Muslim exchanged the rakhi. It was on Rakhi Bandhan Day. And that's when he also composed. He was very good at writing poems as he walked. So as he was walking, he wrote this poem, Amar Shonar Bangla, which is the national anthem today of Bangladesh. So it was such an uprising, peaceful uprising, that Curzon had to rescind the orders, which later took place tragically in 1947. And then he got the Nobel Prize, he was a world figure, and while writing my book on Rabindranath and presenting it at the Stockholm Centenary of Tagore, no Indian has received the tumultuous welcome that Gurudev got. Whether it was in China, imagine today what Xi Jinping would say. He was called the voice of Asia, the thunder of Asia. And the Chinese asked him, then under the Kuomintang regime, the Chinese asked him to come more often and tell them how to fight the complete chaotic situation in China. In Japan, he was lauded. Vietnam, Cambodia, and then in America, he went, France, and Germany, which was shattered after the First World War. They lionized him everywhere. And so he was a great figure. The British laid low for a while. Then after the massacre in Jallianwala Bagh, and the British, not to be outdone for the Nobel Prize, they gave him the knighthood, which he was not very eager to take, but his more reasonable friends said, you will do much more good to Indians if you take this. So he accepted it very graciously. Then after the massacre of Jallianwala Bagh, he was outraged and he wrote a letter, which I think is, I don't think I'm saying this as hyperbole, but I think which is as great as Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, ending with the words that I'm voicing the words, the feelings of a population which is struck numb and dumb with horror. So I wish to be treated as the humblest of the Indians and return the knighthood, which no Indian has done. And there were many knights, many lords, many barons in India at that time. Not one of them returned the knighthood or even protested. So when some people, this is to digress, but I must get it off my chest. When some people say that Rabindranath was a stooge of the British, I sometimes wonder if it's worth replying to such inanities. And there are quite a few. And one of them, who was my father's friend, for which the friendship broke up, wrote a letter that Jana Gana Mana was composed to honor George V of Bela. Jana Gana Mana was written on 27 December 1911 at the first Indian National Congress meeting in Calcutta. And the words are actually, like many patriotic songs, national anthems, it's praise to the motherland. And since I've done work on Russian literature, this is an abiding theme in literature, especially in 19th century. And one lady wrote recently in Indian Express, which I thought was wonderful, I wish I'd got back to her, saying that many Indians don't know, non-Bengalis, that there are 5 stanzas in this national anthem. And that you must have read that, and she said, I'll tell you, the second stanza is a beautiful line, Daruno Biplavo Mache, Tabu Shankut Pulibaje. That in the midst of rebellion, I can hear your Shankar blowing, Conchero. Then the third stanza, he ends by, He Chiro Sharati, Taborathu Chakre, Mukharito Holodino Ratri. Now, how the eternal charioteer Lord Krishna could be George V beatsman. And this has been going round, which is. So, after this returning from knighthood, the British became a little rough with him, told many government officials began sending their children to Vishwabharati because it was such a stylish place, bubbling with intelligentsias from all over the world, great scholars were coming. But the British began to tell the government officers, don't send your children there to study. Then the final act of defiance, in 1930, the new Soviet Republic asked Gurudev to come to Russia. They invited him, and very few at that time were willing to go because Soviet Union was then a young republic, communist. The West was paranoid about Russia, especially England and France, not Germany, who was having secret dealings with the Soviet arm factory. This I didn't know until I was doing my work on the Russian Revolution, that Russia was actually playing as devious a game as the British by arming Germany. But the British were hoping that Germany would finish off Russia. So they told him not to go. There was a letter from the Viceroy that he should not accept the invitation. Rabindranath said, I'll go. And he went with some misgiving because he didn't know what to expect. It was an alien country, he had been to Europe. And he wrote a rapturous travelogue called Letters from Russia. It's not that he didn't see the defects, he pointed out so many defects of the system, but he also said this is a new experiment in human society, of brotherhood, of equality, of dignity for the humble and the poor. And this was really angered the British. They banned the book, but the Vishwabharati press worked overtime and printed copies and was sent all over India. And so his was a life of great courage, and political courage, emotional courage, and a person of such infinite compassion. I don't want to go into details of my father's interaction with him, always willing to encourage people. So perhaps Bela found a lot of consolation in writing about him, and finally how to face what requires the greatest courage is facing death. So over the years, my mother started editing her sister's book. Then she decided that when they were in Rome, that she would write a book on Bankim Chandra, who is well known all over India. He was the first great modern novelist. And she began working on him. And of course, being a student of Bengali literature, she gave a background of Bengali literature, the historical setting, and she believed that Bengali literature, like Hindi, Marathi, Gujarati literature, Karnataka literature also, Kannada, were really an offshoot of Sanskrit. And that the great classical age of Sanskrit did much to shape modern Indian literature. And so she traced the historical setting, beginning with Bengali history, how it evolved, how the language evolved. So there again, it was an admiration for Bankim Chandra, not as only a great novelist, but also as a man of courage, because his book, Anandamot, which has the famous song Vande Mataram, which is our second national anthem, so to speak. It deals with the Sannyasi rebellion of 1776, when the East India Company was wreaking havoc on Bengal and Bihar and Orissa. They were turning rice fields into indigo plants, forced labor, slave labor, and persecuting the weavers. They had their thumbs cut off so that they could not weave, and the raw material was taken from Bengal and East India and sent to the Lancashire mills. And if I may quote Karl Marx, he said the Industrial Revolution of Western Europe was based on the plunder of India. The raw material, the people, cheap labor. So this Bankim Chandra wrote in graphic detail. So my mother was inspired by this, and she began writing it, she completed it. And there again a very sad story that soon after, she wanted it to be published for Bankim Chandra's 150th birth anniversary. Soon after she wrote it, she also passed away. And I'm afraid in the turmoil that happens in a family like after such events, my sister and I didn't really know where the manuscripts were. And it was while we were getting the material, digging up the material in Shantiniketan for writing our joint book, Treaty of Versailles, that we found these two manuscripts. In a way, it was really heartbreaking that it had lain neglected in a trunk in our house in Shantiniketan. So I told my sister, you must translate it, because her Bengali was very good. And so she translated it. Little by little, some editing had to be done. And she's the translator of the book. She had earlier translated a very famous Bengali classic, The Tales of Tuntuni, the Wise Bird, which was written by Satyajit Ray's grandfather. And I contributed 2 more articles on Pushkin and Solzhenitsyn. The theme of the book is courage, which one of the panelists in the Calcutta launch said, if you have courage, everything else follows. If you have courage, you're generous. If you have courage, you're honorable. If you have courage, you do the right thing. And doing the right thing is not always easy. And many great writers have done the right thing and suffered, like Solzhenitsyn, like Pushkin. And so this, to me, seems the greatest virtue in a human character. And because if you have that, everything else follows. So I will ask Nandini, the Russian expert, to speak on Pushkin. And sir, if you will give your views on this.
I must start with a disclaimer. I am not an expert on Russian language. I want to make that very clear. I did study it for a few years, 3-4 years. After that, I worked with it for about 2 or 3 years, but after that, it's been in limbo. And Achala's request has really helped me to go back to my Russian books after, I would say, about 23 years. I just opened up the books because she asked me to talk on Pushkin. So, before I start on Pushkin, just want to give you a flavor of what sort of poetry. He was one of the leading poets of the Soviet Union, Russia. And I just want to read a few of his poems to give you a feeling of what he wrote, what sort of things he wrote about. This is a poem he wrote in 1828. Pushkin's time was, he was born in 1799 and he died in 1837. So I think 1835 or so, I'm a little bit unsure. Okay. So in 1828, he wrote this poem. It's called The Flower. The flower shriveled, lacking fragrance, forgotten in a book I see, and instantly my soul awakens, filled with the curious reverie. When did it bloom? Last spring or earlier? And for how long? Where was it plucked? By whom? By fingers alien or by familiar? And why put here as in a tomb? To mark a tender meeting by it? A parting with a precious one? Or just to walk alone and quiet in forest shade, in meadow's sun? Is she alive? Is he still with her? Where is their haven at this hour? Or did they both already wither like this unfathomable flower? It's very touching, a very sweet feeling, very lot of compassion and empathy in this.
Would you give us the Russian flavor also?
I don't have this. I'll give you Russian flavor also. I'll start with the English, so then give the Russian flavor. There's another one where he says, don't ask me why. Don't ask me why, alone in dismal thought, in times of mirth, I'm often filled with strife. And why my weary stare is so distraught, and why I don't enjoy the dream of life. Don't ask me why my happiness has perished, why I don't love the love that pleased me then. No longer can I call someone my cherished, who once felt love will never love again, who once felt bliss no more will feel its essence. A moment's happiness is all that we receive from youth, prosperity and joyful pleasantry, and all that is left is apathy and grief. So now, as I've been requested, a little bit of the Russian flavor. Now this poem is called Ya vas lyubil, means I once loved you, I loved you. And this poem has been described as the quintessential statement of the theme of lost love in Russian poetry. And it's also an example of Pushkin's respectful attitude towards women. It was written in 1830. Я вас любил. Любовь еще, быть может, в душе моей угасла не совсем. Translated, I loved you once. Perhaps I should exclaim, my love still lingers deep within my core. Но пусть она вас больше не тревожит, я не хочу печалить вас ничем. But I do not want to cause you any pain, so grieve thee not for me a moment more. Я вас любил, безмолвно, безнадежно, то робостью, то ревностью томил. Silently and hopelessly I loved you. Tormented, I was too jealous and too shy. Я вас любил так искренно, так нежно, как дай вам Бог, любимой, быть с другим. May God provide another who will love you just as gently and as fervently as I. This is one of the most famous, one of his poems on love. He wrote this. Would you like to hear any more of the Russian ones?
Yeah.
There's another one which again is very famous and very commonly recited by most people who read on Pushkin's poetry. This poem reflects an episode from Pushkin's life when he met Anna Kern briefly in St. Petersburg in 1819. She was only 18 and Pushkin was struck by her charm and beauty. So it says, Я помню чудное мгновение, передо мной явилась ты, как мимолетное видение, как гений чистой красоты. I still recall the wondrous moment when you appeared before my eyes, just like a fleeting apparition, just like pure beauty's distillation. В утомлениях грусти безнадежной, в тревогах шумной суеты, звучал мне долго голос нежный и снились милые черты. Whenever I languished in the throes of hopeless grief, amid the troubles of life's vanity, your sweet voice lingered on in me, your dear face came to me in dreams. So now, there's one more, which I think is a very, very sweet poem also. It's called Ti and Vi. Now, Ti is like in Indian we say Tu, and Vi is like Aap. Even in India we have the tradition that we respect any elders, and we always say Aap. And even if you person you don't know, you refer to them as Aap. Never normally we don't start off saying Ti or Tu. So this poem is dedicated to Anna Olenina, who once, by mistake, unconsciously, she said Ti to Pushkin. And the following Sunday he brought her this poem. He wrote this poem, Ti and Vi. Like in India and also in standard Russian, Vi is used as the appropriate form of address between adults. And now the more intimate Ti is usually reserved for very close friends, for lovers, and for God. So here it is, Ti and Vi. Pustoj vi srdečni mi, a pustoj vi srdečni ti, она обмолвя заменила. И все счастливые мечты в душе влюбленной возбудила. She substituted by a chance for empty you, the gentle thou, and all my happy dreams at once in the loving heart again resound. Пред ней задумчиво стою, свести очей с нее нет силы, и говорю ей, как вы милы, и мыслю, как тебя люблю. In bliss and silence do I stay, unable to maintain my role. Oh, how sweet you are, I say. How I love thee, says my soul. So this was Pushkin, basically the romantic Pushkin, writing these poems. But as we want to talk about basically his courage in what he was in his times, how he addressed his feelings with problems, rebellions in Russia at that time, his sympathy for them, and his way of writing. He started off, as we all know, Pushkin, those of you see photographs of him, he has features which are a little different, and it can be traced back to his ancestry. His great-grandfather was from, as I had known so far, was from Abyssinia, but I was clarified by Amita just now saying that it's been proved that his great-grandfather was from Chad, Eritrea in Africa. Ibrahim Ganibal was his great-grandfather, and he was captive prince who became the personal servant of Peter the Great and later was absorbed into the nobility of St. Petersburg. Pushkin's mother was known as the beautiful Creole. She also had part of the features of that region. And Pushkin was very proud of his ancestry and had great admiration also for Peter the Great. Sometimes we draw a lot of similarity between these two people, Pushkin and Peter the Great. Both symbolize the spirit of Russian Renaissance. Both were eager to assimilate and innovate, to absorb Western ideas and put a Russian character. That's what both had done. Now, Pushkin received a very excellent education at the Lyceum in Satskaya Sela. His romance with literature started there while he was at the Lyceum. And his talent was already evident. At the Lyceum, Pushkin was asked to recite his poem before the enigmatic literary figure, Derzhavin, who in a way we can say was the precursor of Pushkin because he was the one who inaugurated the literature of protest, which later we find in a lot of Pushkin's work. Protest against the monarchy, protest against autocracy, protest and sympathy, protest against the rigidity of the country at that time, and his love for the rebellions, for the poor people. That was Pushkin another side. So he read out a poem, one of his compositions, in front of Derzhavin, and Derzhavin was so impressed, and he called him his successor. And later Pushkin writes about this meeting. He says, "Stari Derzhavin na samete, if gro khadzia blagaslovili," meaning this old Derzhavin has noticed us, and entering his grave has blessed us also, writing this. So after graduating from the Lyceum, Pushkin lived his normal carefree life, court life in St. Petersburg. He was the first of the literati to come under the spell of Byron, and he joined the association of young men who were interested in those days in liberal politics and literature, and he, inspired by Byron also, he wrote his first poetry poem in protest. It was called The Ode to Liberty. It reads like this. I'll first read the English one. "Henceforward, monarchs, learn ye well. No punishment, no accolade, no altar and no dungeon cell can be your steadfast barricade. The first bowed head must be your own, beneath law's trusty canopy. The people's life and liberty forevermore shall guard your throne." So he's making it clear that the rulers have to give a move, accept the people, give more liberty to the people. That's what he wrote that. Actually, this poem at that time of writing was held to be very subversive and revolutionary in Russia at that time. It had a talismanic significance for many a young revolutionary. And whenever they found manuscripts of it, people who were found with it were always arrested and the manuscripts were confiscated. One, for example, was there that among the disloyal writings possessed by officers of a regiment, the Kiev Grenadier Regiment, they found these writings, and promptly the Tsar said Pushkin must be sent to exile, and Pushkin was exiled. So there, his courage, and for his courage, he's banished off to Caucasus. And as soon as the poem reached the hands of the police, Pushkin was promptly exiled to the Caucasus in 1821. Exile was a torment, but it was also the turning point in his life. And when exile, he met General Raevsky and his daughter Maria. She was a beautiful and very young, intense and erudite 17-year-old who inspired Pushkin, and they would often discuss literature together. She waited for him to offer marriage, but the tempestuous poet could not make up his mind. But the spell of Maria and the memory of her grace and nobility never left Pushkin. In fact, Maria was the model of Pushkin's two famous heroines, Tatiana in Yevgeny Onegin and Masha in the other novel called Captain's Daughter or Kapitanskaya Dochka. And on his deathbed, he composed perhaps the most beautiful of his poems dedicated to Maria, his lady. He says, "This is for you, but will the rhythm of this dark music touch your ear? And will your modest nature fathom my heart's unruly striving here? Or will the poet's bold submission of verse, as once of love, again pass by without your recognition, as unacknowledged now as then? Know it again, at least, the rhyme that once I think was dear to you, and now that since that parting chime, whatever changing fate I knew, the memory of words last spoken by you and your sad wilderness have been my only sacred token, sole refuge and ultimate redress." He never forgot Maria, and later on in life he met again Maria. There was this rebellion in 1825. The Tsar had died and he had not left any proper succession details. So the army rose in revolt, and the the Tsar Alexander I had died, and he was leaving no succession undecided. And then, taking advantage, there was an army revolt in 1825. What they demanded was for a constitution, an end of censorship. Now, these ideas of autocracy, serfdom, intellectual rigidity, and the power of the theocratic state, all these were part of the effects of the invasion of Napoleon Bonaparte in 1812. The Russians got all these ideas also part of that from them. And also this incited Pushkin to write rebellious poetry. And he wrote his poetry which incited the officers of the imperial army who demanded greater freedom of thought and equality. However, the revolt was put down, its leaders executed, and this revolt was in December. And they were called the Decembrists. The rest of the Decembrists were exiled to Siberia to work, to hard labor in the mines there. Among those people who went into exile was Prince Volkonsky, who was Maria's husband. And Pushkin at that time wrote a poem. He wrote a poem called Poslanie v Sibir, or Letter to Siberia. And Maria also was joining her husband in exile to Siberia, and she carried that letter. And following this letter, again the Tsar, furious, and again exiled him to some other place. I shall tell you. The protest that, and one very interesting side here is, Pushkin refers to Maria as the daughter of the Ganges. He compares her to Sita, who followed her husband in exile. So Pushkin compares Maria, who's following Prince Volkonsky, to Siberia on exile. And this poem of Pushkin, which he wrote, the Letter to Siberia, the poem written in protest speaks of his sympathy and support for the cause. And the imperial court again noted the fiery homage with fury and summoned him to St. Petersburg for questioning. Now the poem reads thus: V glubine sibirskih rud hranice gordaje terpenje. In the depths of the Siberian mines, keep the haughty patience. Akovi tyažki padut, temnici ruknut, izvoda vas primjer radosna uvkoda, I bratia meč vam oddadut. The heavy chains will fall, the prison doors will open, freedom will await you, your brothers will hand back your sword. This is what he wrote again. It was against the throne, against the Tsar, and promptly he was moved back to questioning. He was sent back to, asked to come back to St. Petersburg to question. So this is idea about the courage Pushkin had. It's sort of, despite the fact that they knew they'd be either exiled, executed, banished, but he had the ability to keep on writing. He supported rebellions, he supported wherever. And there's a very nice way that Achala has put it in her book. It's a very well written thing. It says, Pushkin had sort of enriched the Russian language, mingling it with sweetness, precision, and vitality. Pushkin had the true poet's gift of turning the commonplace into poetry. He was neither narrow nor chauvinistic, and his range of sympathy extended beyond Russian frontiers. Pushkin saw Russia as a synthesis of Asia and Europe, between Byzantine religion and Western culture. This all-encompassing understanding became a Russia phenomenon and explains why, after a century and a half of political and social upheavals, Pushkin still remains the beloved of Russian poets and people. His place is unique in literature, Russian literature. He gave to Russian literature the special gifts of his own genius as historian, poet, storyteller, and critic. He was also a rebel with a cause. He voiced strong protest against social and political injustice. In an age of privilege for the rich, he spoke for the poor. In an era of conquests, he glorified liberty, and he paid with his life for his defiance. When Pushkin died, the celebrated Russian literary critic Belinsky wrote, "Solnce ruskoy poezy zakatilas," the sun of Russian poetry has set, has gone down. Thank you very much.
Since I don't know Russian, I will take the local flavor and say Nandini Dhanyavadadalu. But let me, in the interest of time, rush through some of the basic facets of a lesser known personality, Bankim Chandra Chattopadhyay. Now, Bankim Chandra Chattopadhyay, who was born on 27th June 1838 and died on 8th April 1894, is perhaps better known to the modern day Indians, present company accepted, is perhaps known to the modern day Indians as the author of Vande Mataram, a song which had fired the patriotic zeal of young and old alike in those heady days of freedom struggle. The song still arouses the same passion, perhaps for the reasons which Bankim couldn't have discerned at that point of time. But it's important to note, this song, which had fired the patriotic zeal of many, was given the status of a national song by the government in June 2017 by the present government. However, it's not widely known. It is discussed in detail by Achala's mother, Leela Mazumdar Moulik, in page 73 and other points, that Bankim Chandra was one of the earliest and perhaps one of the finest exponent of Bengal Renaissance, which had brought the elite of Bengal in close contact with Western civilization, culture, and its civilizational values. And this had profound impact on Bankim Chandra in his later day works. Bankim was a very curious mixture of traditions and Western modernity. He got married when he was all of 11 years old to a girl who was 5 years old. He was 19 years old and a university student when the 1857 uprising took place, and which had erupted first in Barakpur near Kolkata. And he graduated with a degree in law in 1858 when the uprising had been effectively suppressed. In 1858, the same year, the young graduate Bankim applied to the East Indian Company to join its civil service. He was an extremely bright student. He was immediately selected and he joined the service of East India Company and served the East India Company in its civil service till he retired in 1891. In 1894, he was posthumously awarded the title Companion Order of the Indian Empire. There is no clarity whether this was in recognition of his administrative skill or in genuine admiration to his literary achievements. Bankim, being already in the other world, could obviously throw no light on this unexpected development. Bankim's works reflect that he was a prolific writer, poet, and a journalist. It's interesting to note that Bankim, who wrote mostly in verse, in prose, unlike Pushkin, who wrote mostly in verse, he had flirted with Bengali verse to begin with. And those verses were published in the then well-known weekly journal published by Ishwar Chandra Gupta. He was himself a noted poet and verse writer. In his weekly journal called Samachar Darpan. His first essay, or rather novel in writing, which was published in English. It was a book called Rajmohan's Wife. It was a book of, what shall I say, indifferent value, excepting that it dealt with certain very unconventional subjects. It dealt with a fiery lady called Matangini, who was married to a ruffian and who developed an affiliation for his brother-in-law. Now, this was a totally taboo subject, and Bankim wrote that. Probably he was a little scared to write it in Bengali, so he wrote it in English. But nevertheless, it taught Bankim a very valuable lesson, that his niche was in Bengali prose. And he therefore went to Bengali prose. His Bengali publications initially were in other Bengali journals, but he soon started his own magazine, a monthly magazine called Bangodarshan, and many of his writings first featured there, and there, along with other notable Bengali intellectuals of that time, one person who attracted attention was a very young Rabindranath Tagore. Bankim's historical novels came about with his first novel called Durgesh Nandini, which literally means daughter of the Lord of the Fort. This came out in 1865, and very soon it was lapped up by the young Bengali intellectuals and others alike, and he was given the sobriquet Walter Scott of Bengal. The other novels of Bankim were which came out in regular intervals, were Kapal Kundala in 1866, Mrinalini in 1869, Vish Vriksha in 1873, Chandrasekhar in 1877, Rajani in 1877, Raj Singha in 1881, Anandamot, his most famous, in 1882, and Devi Chaudharani in 1884. Amidst all this, he was writing, editing and publishing his Bangodarshan, and there he was making his political philosophy, his ideas on religion, everything in clear terms. It would not be wrong to assert that he was perhaps one of the first Indian intellectuals to stress that if Indians were not to lose their identity and self-esteem, they must return to their literary, religious and cultural roots. If you think a little carefully, this political philosophy of returning to the literary, religious and cultural roots indeed have deeply influenced modern day politics as well. Bankim had a very subtle sense of humor and irony, and he let them to be used in full flow in a delightful series called Kamalakante Doctor, from the diary of Kamalakanta, in which Kamalakanta, who is an idle person, in his musings induced by opium-aided stupor, makes profound observations on high philosophy as well as everyday life of the Bengal. And I would urge you, many of you may actually like to go through those which revealed the deep political understanding and thought of Bankim Chandra. He had in a delightful chapter on Kamalakanta had referred in his opium stupor to a cat who had demanded his share of milk. Now all opium eaters, they require a little bit of milk at a particular time. Now the cat was protesting, as Kamalakanta realized, that why must you have always the milk? What about me? And you have all kinds of stuff otherwise. I have nothing. You eat all the fish. You don't even leave the bones for me. So, and then the cat talked in very strong terms about socialism. And Kamalakanta got very upset. He said, this is extremely seditious. You mustn't talk like this. So then the cat became very, very angry and really sort of gave a tongue lashing to Bankim Chandra, and those are delightful readings. Delightful readings. And when all this was over, then Kamalakanta woke up, and he woke up only because the milkmaid, the lady who used to come the milk, and she said, "What happened to you, Kamalakanta? Why are you screaming in your dream?" So this was again one way of making, sort of letting loose his own political philosophy. He was a deep thinker. He was a deep thinker, there's no doubt about it. And the Vande Mataram which he wrote, it was indeed a stirring song, there's no doubt about it. No less a person than Rabindranath Tagore had written that I would have loved that in free India, if the national anthem becomes Bankim Chandra's Vande Mataram. It was Rabindranath who said that. And both Rabindranath and Bankim Chandra had shared a beautiful relationship, a kind of mutual admiration and respect, which unfortunately has been sullied later on by some totally misguided people, I mean, whose main claim to fame is to sort of compartmentalize them. I mean, in their very misguided thought, Jana Gana Mana represents the pseudo-secularists and minority appeasers, and Vande Mataram is the real song for national aspirations and the Bharat Mata. Totally misguided. Bankim Chandra and Rabindranath, wherever they are, must be wringing their hands in sheer agony about this. But that's perhaps not the subject matter of this. I think we are about to reach a time when we can take some questions and answers. Three of us, with our very limited knowledge, I'm sorry, Achala would have much more knowledge than that. We'll try to respond to these questions. So,
Dasgupta has raised, said in the beginning, why these four authors were taken. So before you all ask questions, I'd like to say that, of course, there have been many great Indian writers with rebellion in their hearts, and in Russia probably even more, especially throughout the Tsarist times and throughout the early Soviet times, when young men, disillusioned by the Bolshevik Revolution, protested, and they met very terrible fates, of which the last was Alexander Solzhenitsyn. Now, Pushkin and Rabindranath, though separated by century from his death to Gurudev's birth, they were great nationalists, and they had deep patriotism in all their works which colored it. Rabindranath went back to the Indian traditions, culture. Many people don't know who read his modern poems, that he went back often to India's classical traditions, from the Ramayana, mainly the Mahabharata, and from Kalidas. And Pushkin did the same thing. He went back to the medieval times. His famous poem, the Boris Godunov, is actually a terrific drama about a usurper with a lot of nobility in him, a murderer who has nobility in him. So both Pushkin and Rabindranath did not divorce themselves and become, though Rabindranath was the father of a new tradition in Bengali literature, as was Pushkin, they remained very deeply rooted to their culture. And the other thing was this, while Pushkin revolted against Tsarism, Rabindranath revolted against British rule. And the poem that Nandini read out to the Siberian mines is very much like Rabindranath's famous poem, Achala M, which he wrote after the 1905 revolution. And that is a very stirring poem. If I just take time to read it, which my sister has translated. It's very original, is wonderful, but this is Aloka's contribution. If no one responds to your call, then go marching alone. If no one speaks to you, luckless one, if all are afraid and turn away, then let your own words bloom. If people close their doors on a stormy night, march alone with blood-stained feet. If no one offers you a lamp, ignite your heart to light your way. So there's so much of Pushkin's message to the Siberian mines and this. And the other thing, which is, of course, could be of any authors, both of them had this. Rabindranath's, of course, love story was a very tragic one. Pushkin's he was partly to blame, because he was an irresponsible poet, restless, so he couldn't make up his mind about Maria, and when she finally got married, he became her pole star, she became his pole star, but it was too late, and then he went into a disastrous marriage, which indirectly was the cause of his death. And Rabindranath never recovered from the love he had for Kadambari Devi. It's a very tragic story, and my biography of Rabindranath, which was written for his 150th anniversary, really angered the Brahma Samaj in Bengal, because I had said that this great man, Maharshi Devendranath, I hope you know Brahma Samaj, you are? No. Because Maharshi Devendranath did something so utterly cruel, sadistic, callous. When he got to know that there was this romance between his son and Kadambari, they had grown up actually as children, because Rabindranath lost his mother, and Choto Bautan, as he called her, became the playmate. Later, she was little mother, and he used to go to her with every work of his to get her opinion, because she was a very erudite young lady. Then when this romance came to the notice of the so-called Maharshi, he decided, today, sometimes I think, though we are a very brutal and violent society, I think where human beings, human relations are concerned, we are much more humane. So instead of calling the son and reading him the riot act, he took Kadambari, Rabindranath's beloved, to choose a girl for Rabindranath, who had absolutely no idea whom she was marrying, a 10-year-old girl of a minor clerk in his estate. And this was such a horrible punishment that for Rabindranath, and this is what I have never been able to understand, and my sister and I used to discuss, how is it a man who defied the British Empire could not defy his father and tell him go to hell? Well, he got married, but it took such a toll on Kadambari that 2 months after his marriage, she committed suicide. And Maharshi never reprimanded his son, who was probably the cause of this romance, Jatindranath Tagore, who was a womanizer, theatre goer, absolutely profligate, irresponsible man. So, you see, he was a traditional old man who didn't do. But Kadambari and Maria have a lot of similarity because both these women inspired these two great poets. And Bankim Chandra had a lot of similarity with many of Pushkin's stories. Durgesh Nandini was very much like The Captain's Daughter, the story of a fort, the rebellion, a young officer, except that, as I was telling Nilufer, Bankim Chandra finally couldn't live up to the courage of letting Ayesha marry Jagat Singh. I wish he had. Then, of course, the book might have been banned today.
Murdered, not banned.
So, there was similarity between them. And Solzhenitsyn, of course, stands apart from all this because he belongs to a different age. But the courage he showed, I think, was greater than any of them. And he was a young artillery officer in the Second World War. He was thrice decorated, Battle of Stalingrad, Leningrad, all the battles he fought. And then he made of just one sentence something to do with which he didn't think that Stalin was probably sacrificing too many lives. But in a very roundabout way, how the censors got it. And this thrice decorated hero, who had not started writing then, was sentenced to labor camp, which he survived, got cancer, survived, and then the Soviet regime sent him abroad into exile. I think that was their favorite, the Russian authorities. So they sent him off to America. I said, all right, now taste freedom. And Solzhenitsyn did something incredible, that when he was giving, the West was lionizing him because anybody who revolts against Russia is darling of the West. So they were lionizing him and he was asked to come and speak in Harvard. And there was absolutely silence when he said, the West has to forget individual rights and think of human rights. You have violated all the human rights. I think this pleased Boris Yeltsin so much, he called him back. And Boris Yeltsin, who wrecked Russia, will go to heaven for only that one thing, that he called back Solzhenitsyn to the country. So, sir, as you said, there are many authors with great courage, great talent. So what I thought was these four people were tied by this invisible bond.
Yes, ma'am. You had a question.
Yes.
Actually, I'd like to direct one question at Ms. Achala Moulik. You spoke about angering the Brahmo Samaj over your criticism of Devendranath Tagore. Why is it that we have these holy cows in India, pun intended, that we cannot speak against them? That's one. And to Mr. Dasgupta, a question about Bankim Chandra and this going back to cultural, religious stories, epics, and how much and how safe is it to go back to them given the present situation of India? Thank you.
If I may take the question on the Bankim Chandra first and let Achala tackle the rest. Bankim Chandra remained a prisoner to his to the fact that he was a civil servant. I understand that syndrome because I have myself been a civil servant. So this is very common. Now, therefore, he took recourse to certain, what shall I say, subtle subterfuges. When he was talking of religious freedom and going back to the religious root, he was harking back to, almost like the Knight Templars of Christianity. And he was harking back to old tradition without intending any communal divide. Unconsciously, he did create a communal divide when in his Anandamat, while referring to the sannyasi revolution, he referred to the Muslim sepoys of East India Company in very derogatory terms. The term used by him, which is very, very colloquial, was nede. I mean, it's impossible to translate it except to say it is a very derogatory way of referring to the Muslims. But actually, he was trying to hit at the East India Company, which he couldn't do being a civil servant. So, as I said, Bankim Chandra's problem was that he was a curious mixture. Conservatism, modernity, the fact that he was in civil service and a family to maintain, all these used to have their play and interplay within him, and he had to be, sometimes unduly cautious, sometimes unconsciously creating divides. It's difficult to explain this in very rational terms. But unfortunately, some of these so-called contradictions in Bankim Chandra have been magnified in the present day, which is creating real problem. The so-called communal divide, etc. Some of it, in fact, could be an unintended backlash of how some people are interpreting Bankim Chandra.
This, as you say, holy cow. Actually, I didn't know about the story of Kadambari and Maharshi Devendranath. And then a brilliant book came by Sudhir Kakar about the Tagore family. And it took him, a Punjabi, to demolish the Bengali myth of the Tagores. But we do have, and it's not just Indians or us or Bengalis, this holy myth is there everywhere. There are holy cows, certain icons have to be preserved. It's all over in the West. For instance, Thomas Jefferson, the man who wrote those imperishable words, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, he had 160 slaves in his Virginia estate. And he had numerous illegitimate children by his African women.
One son.
Yeah. And now and then in Virginia, a red-headed child comes up, African-American child, who are the progeny. So this is there. I mean, everybody, we built up holy cows, and we surround them with legends, and there's nothing we can do except those who want to demolish the theory.
May I make a comment? Holy cows in today's world and holy cows in the past were demolished by Tagore, by Bankim Chandra in his own way, through the dream of the cat, the hallucination, and by Pushkin and Alexander Solzhenitsyn. But I think of all the four that you have discussed, I think to me, as a non-Bengali, but as a proud Indian, I think Tagore is above all. He is the first person who gives you hope and gives you the courage to walk alone, and really walk alone in so many ways, to protest in a sophisticated manner and in an unruly manner. There are two sides of it. The Raksha Bandhan, which happened years ago, 1905, and what is happening in Bengal today. What is happening in Bengal today?
I think that's a very relevant and very topical observation you have made. There is always this question which torments many minds. In present-day India, it had tormented many people in the past also, as to whether Rabindranath, in spite of his towering personality and decided to be probably the best amongst the four names which have been discussed, did he sacrifice his patriotism and nationalism at the altar of his internationalism? This question has come up in many times, many occasions. The answer is, of course, an emphatic no. His support to the Swadeshi movement, 1905 to 1907, was total and wholehearted. There was no hypocrisy in it. And his love for the country was absolutely unambiguous. But a little later, he became worried when the Swadeshi and subsequent non-cooperation movement launched by Mahatma Ji. There was a kind of a degeneration in which anger and hatred was coming to the fore, and which was leading to certain aberrations. You recollect what happened in Chowri Chowra, which led to Mahatma Ji observing his fast. In his own words, Tagore was totally honest with himself, like Gandhi was, totally honest. As he has expressed himself in his own words, and I quote, "I took a huge step towards patriotism, and then I stopped." I think his numerous visits abroad also convinced him that in addition to our own cultural legacy and wisdom, we need to remain in touch and also learn many things from the world outside to remain relevant and to grow further. I can do no better than quoting one of our BIC member and an eminent historian, Dr. Ram Guha, who in his lectures in Japan and subsequently in the Rosalind Wilson Memorial Lecture in the India International Center, both in 2015, had said, in his own words, Rabindranath believed, and I quote, and the quote is from Ram Guha, Rabindranath believed that we should glory in the light of a lamp lit anywhere in the world. Now, this was the essence of his internationalism, but in no way his patriotism for his own country was less. Both were with him, and finally he said, the final spiritual solace. And this was the conviction of Bankim Chandra also when he wrote in his later days, his Krishna Charitra in Bangadarshan. He more or less came to the same conclusion. And I would also, in this context, mention another controversy which very often was raised in the media as well as in the public about the differences between Mahatma Ji and Rabindranath. Now this has been analyzed by eminent historian Dr. Sabyasachi Bhattacharya in his book called Mahatma and the Poet, which was again adapted for dramatic use by again our member of BIC, Vijay Padki, which was called Poet and the Prophet. Now, if one goes through that, Sabyasachi Bhattacharya's book particularly, they differed with each other in many respects and expressed their differences quite openly and in a quite dignified manner. In fact, their love and respect for each other remained undiminished, and the letters they exchanged must remain as a shining example of how a civilized debate should take place when opinions differ, particularly in a democracy. And therefore, this controversy is actually totally futile.
Yeah, I agree. And also Gandhi got an international, was under an international lamp, to quote, when he used the his West Indian workers movement and brought it to South Africa and then brought it to India. If you look at Faisal Devji, when he talks about his experiences in Gandhi in the West Indies and in Durban and in Johannesburg, the international lamp was on. He decided that he would root himself in Gujarat and in Maharashtra, and then discovered that he had to move forward. And by his moving forward and Akali, his life was ended.
Quite right. Quite right.
Achala, this question is directed towards you. You were actually handed two very interesting pieces of writing, which you have edited. One of them is a view of Tagore, which was 70 years old. Tagore had passed away in 1941. This is something written in 1948. So it is in effect something that you have picked out of a time capsule. And when you have edited it, I'm sure there are pieces that you have left out, there are things that you have added. What I would like to get a sense from you on both Tagore and Bankim, that your mother translated some time ago, is that...
Mother wrote it.
Mother wrote it, but she wrote it some time ago. What I'm trying to get at is, when you read it, did you see that there was a different perception of Tagore 70 years ago compared to what we as educated people today look at? The same with Bankim. Was there a difference from what your aunt's and your mother's perspectives, separated by nearly 3/4 of a century? If there's anything that you could share that you learned from that, that would be very interesting.
Bankim Chandra, I think, was... I don't think I could add anything to it or see. It was perhaps because my mother put it in the context of the history of Bengali literature, the history of the early British rule, and about his works. I think the perception is, as I see it today, it hasn't really changed much. Of course, he was a patriot, and the fact that he was a very courageous man, and that he was part of this great effulgence of... My mother believed, she was also a Sanskrit student, that Bengali literature flowed from Ishwar Chandra Vidyashagar and the Vidyapati, Jaydev, Chandidas, that they were all part of one great stream. And there wasn't much that she saw later when she wrote this book in the 60s. In Rabindranath, I see there was a lot which my sister and I used to discuss when she was translating it, that the perceptions of Gurudev have changed. Because in my aunt's essay, which Aloka had to trim it, this universality of Rabindranath was more obvious than his, rebellion and his taking on the British Raj, doing things which were unconventional. that has changed. And I think Rabindranath has emerged in these 150 years of his birth, 100 years since he got the Nobel Prize, as a much more universal figure. He's no longer a Bengali poet or an Indian poet or the greatest Indian of our age. I think he has become something much wider, and that they said in one beautiful piece in a Spanish literature about El Cid, that he moved from history into eternity. And that I found we had to sort of, bring it more into focus with today's world.
Mr. Dasgupta, this is a question for you and perhaps a comment for Achala. Question is very prosaic. What is pseudo-secular about Janaganamana? Right.
Good. I was going to ask that. And why is the objection to Vande Mataram?
Okay, may I finish? These two are appropriate. The comment, if you like, was Achala said something about Sanskrit having influenced all literature, Indian literature, so to speak. Not so sure of that, especially in this part of the country. But let's not get into that. Last Sunday, Jayant Narlikar gave a talk on culture of science at the Bangalore Planetarium. At the end of the talk, in response to a question, he made the comment that not too long ago, he came across something written in very chaste Sanskrit about how this, you can call it a provident fund if you like, was there in Sanskrit as well. 1/8 of what you earned was set aside, and a similar amount was added to by your employer. So he looked at this and he got some Sanskrit scholars in Pune to look at it, and when it was all confirmed, apparently, he wrote an article in the Times of India about this, which got widely publicized. His original alma mater was BHU. So two pundits from there, and I'm quoting him, wrote and said this is a complete fabrication. And this is a clerk in the East India Company who wrote this. So we have, if you like, put Sanskrit on a pedestal. So especially if it's chaste Sanskrit, whether it resembles Kalidasa's time or something else, is considered right. And your comments about Vande Mataram were appropriate, and perhaps you can answer her question first before the comment can be taken up.
Sure. I had made it clear that the expression that one represents pseudo-secularist and the other represents the so-called right tastes is a perversion of thought. This was never intended, and no right-thinking Indian or one who has studied the background or backdrop under which these Jana Gana Mana and Vande Mataram were written would nurse such a interpretation. But let me clarify again how this whole confusion was started. Very recent. A gentleman who was once Chief Minister of UP, whose claim to fame was that he actively or passively aided and abetted the demolition of the Babri Masjid, he raised this topic saying that it is an act of psychophancy to put Jana Gana Mana as the national anthem because it was written in praise of George V. And therefore, it should be what he said was very surprising. He said, if it has to remain national anthem, let some portions be rewritten. Now, that was outrageous. He, in fact, offered his own suggestions, and what he was not taken. What became more serious was that a venerable former Supreme Court judge, Bankim Chandra Chattopadhyay, who is known for his maverick-like qualities, he wrote very scathing, and they are really not worth quoting, and I didn't intend to quote it, but let me clarify. Bankim Chandra said that since the poem was composed and sung as an act of sycophancy to George V, it didn't deserve to be the national anthem. Now this has been nailed by Sabyasachi Bhattacharya in his very definitive book on Rabindranath, and he has used historical data and cold logic. He said that the Delhi Darbar, when George V was proclaimed as Emperor of India, was held on 12th December, a day after Rabindranath composed the poem. It was most certainly not sung during the Darbar, and even by telegraphic Morse code, the poem and its music couldn't be transmitted or sung in or during the Darbar. It was actually sung, as Achala said a little while ago, on 28th December 1911 at the Congress session in Kolkata, and also thereafter at the Foundation Day program of Adi Brahma Samaj in February 1912. Rabindranath himself had said, neither George V nor George VI or any other George could have been the theme of my poem when I wrote it. And let's take his word for that, because as I said some time ago, all said and done, Rabindranath was no hypocrite. He explained himself quite concisely, clearly, and cogently. Now, therefore, Janagana Mana, after it was raised, as late as 2015, this all became strident. That this is the... Why is it? Because it was written by a sycophant, and the sycophant was championed and lionized by a party which ruled the government for a very long time, and therefore something needed to be done. If not rewriting the poem, then something else. I mentioned earlier, it was in 2017, it was accorded the status of a national song, which it richly deserved. Rabindranath himself wanted it to be a national song. But whether it is coincidence or otherwise, this status was accorded rather late in 2017. Simultaneously, another perverse interpretation was that Bankim Chandra, when he wrote Vande Mataram, he was thinking of a Hindu goddess. And this Hindu goddess was something which the Muslims can never tolerate. And therefore, it is something which the minority appeasers, led by the former followers of the sycophant, led them to champion it in the Constituent Assembly and give the national anthem status to Janagana. On the other hand, now that communal divide, which is coming into fore very prominently, it is emphasizing that Bankim Chandra's 10-headed goddess was actually the Bharat Mata. So that's how this is. It is not worth mentioning at all. It's so perverse, this controversy, totally perverse.
No further questions. I'd like all of us to thank Mrs. Achala Moulik, Mr. Dasgupta and Mrs. Dasgupta for a fascinating evening on 4 very interesting writers whom we would probably be best served to research a little more. And I look forward to reading the book. Thank you.
If I will take the liberty of thanking all of you for the very gracious patience with which you have listened to us. Thank you.